Mr. President, I appreciate the kind remarks and the comments about the appropriations process and bill by the ranking member, the Vice Chairman of the committee. In this package of appropriation bills is the FSGG that was just talked about by the senator from Oklahoma, the chairman of that subcommittee, of which I'm a member. But tonight I want to speak about an aspect of that appropriations bill. I want to speak on the evolving threats in cybersecurity that not only pose harm to individual Americans, but also to federal agencies that are tasked with ensuring the economic and national security of our nation. In recent years, it has become clear that threats in cybersecurity are rapidly changing. Cyber attacks are not only growing in volume, but also in complexity. I chair the subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee. It's a subcommittee on commerce, consumer protection, product safety, insurance, and data security. I've convened hearings and publicly questioned federal agencies and private corporations alike to determine what standards and practices they have in place to better protect their customers' personal and financial data. With examples of breaches exposing the personally identifiable information of tens of millions of Americans, like the 2015 breach within the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, the ability to compromise data and networks in the federal government cannot be overstated. Companies must do all they can to prevent hackers from gaining access to their customer information. The federal government and state officials must do the same. Advancements in information technology, or IT, will continue to drive the changes in our nation's security, economic competitiveness, communications, healthcare, privacy, and other areas. The federal government must keep pace with these changes through nimble, expeditious, and result-driven decision-making. A stringent and cumbersome budgeting and acquisition process has tied the hands of federal agencies in their efforts to modernize their IT systems in an efficient fashion. The U.S. Government Accountability Office's GAO 2015 High-Risk Series report highlighted several issues it deemed critical to improving IT acquisitions. Specifically, the report stated that about 75% of the $80 billion the federal government spends annually on IT investments is spent operating and maintaining outdated and unsupported legacy systems, creating major cybersecurity vulnerabilities at home and abroad. In fact, the Federal Chief Information Officer, Suzette Kent, recently testified to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, where she identified the replacement of legacy IT systems as critical to achieving stronger federal cybersecurity protections. With the support of the Trump administration, I partnered with Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico to introduce the Modernizing Government Technology, that's been being referred to as MGT Act, in an effort to address the foundational cybersecurity threats that outdated legacy systems in our federal agencies pose. The MGT Act establishes IT working capital funds for 24 CFO Act-eligible agencies and allows them to use savings obtained through streamlining IT systems, replacing legacy products, and transforming to cloud computing for further modernization efforts for up to 3 years. The bill also creates the Technology Modernization Fund, a separate centralized fund within the Department of the Treasury. These resources would be administered across the federal government by the head of the General Services Administration in consultation with a board of federal IT experts. It is fitting that the MGT Act was signed into law last year as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for FY 2018, as cybersecurity policy is increasingly interwoven into comprehensive national security discussions. As contributors to the original drafting of the MGT Act, Senate appropriators demonstrated their continued support for the innovative policy by appropriating $100 million to the Technology Modernization Fund for FY 2018, last year's appropriation bill. Of this original funding, the Technology Modernization Fund has already awarded substantial grants to applicant agencies, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Energy, and the Department of Agriculture, to replace their outdated, unsupported, and vulnerable systems. Given these early-stage successes, I was disappointed to find that the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee for Financial Services and General Government, Subcommittee that the Senator from Oklahoma chairs and I'm a member of provided no funds for the Technology Modernization Fund in the mark for this fiscal year 2019. I appreciate the opportunity to work with Subcommittee Chairman Langford and his staff. It is clear to me in that conversation and those discussions that GSA and OMB need to provide more information on individual agency proposals submitted to and awarded by the Technology Modernization Fund. I work with the subcommittee to include specific reporting requirements in this bill for the agencies to provide Congress. Agency officials have been providing necessary information to appropriators since the markup of the bill, so progress is being made. These common sense requirements are absolutely critical and will lead to more transparency, and it is important that the GSA and OMB work closely with the Appropriations Committee on proposals for moving forward. Congress and the federal agencies must work hand in hand to provide the necessary resources to the Technology Modernization Fund, which, used responsibly, is a vital tool for the federal government task of keeping our nation's critical IT infrastructure efficient and secure. Inherently tied to improving our nation's critical IT infrastructure is bolstering cybersecurity efforts to protect us from those who wish to do us harm in the cyber domain. The federal role in cybersecurity involves both securing federal systems and assisting and protecting non-federal systems. Under current law, all federal agencies have cybersecurity responsibilities relating to their own systems, and many have sector-specific responsibilities. One of the most well-known topics related to our nation's cybersecurity capabilities relates to the intelligence community indicating that Russian cyber actors interfered with U.S. elections. These exposures threaten to compromise one of the most sacred privileges we have as Americans afforded to us in our constitutional freedoms to participate in democracy through an election. Back-end election systems, including voter registration databases, ballot creation systems, voting machines, configuration systems, absentee processing and reporting, and tabulation software are increasingly vulnerable and have been compromised by both private and state actors. While states are charged with primary responsibility of securing their systems, the federal government can bolster those efforts through legislation like the Secure Elections Act, which I co-sponsored in an effort to strengthen protections against foreign interference and prevent Russian meddling in our elections as they did in 2016. Our nation faces existential threats from adversaries such as Russia and China in a warfare we cannot see the rages in the shadows of cyberspace, where cyber attacks know no bounds, affecting our federal systems, our states, and crossing the line among numerous sectors in our nation's critical infrastructure. Our intelligence community and other agencies analyze cyber threats. Whether attacking our democracy or our critical infrastructure, it is important the federal government promptly streamline and share cybersecurity information with state, local, and private sector partners. Through talk of cyber threats to our state networks and critical infrastructure across all sectors continue to grow, this threat is not new, and just last July we saw hackers infiltrate a network of companies that run nuclear plants in the United States, including a power plant in my home state in Kansas. Incidentally, a cross-section of stakeholders at the state and federal level and among the private sector are represented at the Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center, which plays a critical role analyzing and comparing cyber data and intelligence among public-private partners and federal agencies to identify similarities, anomalies, and ways our cyber defenses can improve. The Fusion Center, headquartered in Topeka and managed by the Kansas National Guard, has analytical capability that works as an intermediary supporting companies across the United States in our financial and energy sectors, as well as our intelligence community and the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Homeland Security. With the Fusion Center's ability to access, analyze, and transmit data at classified levels, they are able to more accurately assess cyber threats from the vantage point that private sector partners cannot. Similarly, we are able to share what they learn from cyber attacks on private sector partners to federal agencies. As we look for ways to improve IT systems across the federal government, there is much to be gained from the private sector and their experiences and exposure to cyber attacks. As the Departments of Defense, Energy, and Homeland Security develop and assessment of our nation's cyber infrastructure, I hope they seek the perspective of our private sector partners that have just as much at stake in protecting our cyber infrastructure across the country as does the federal government. We must do all we can to increase our nation's ability to detect, prevent, and respond to cybersecurity attacks, which is why fully funding the Technology Modernization Fund is so important to bolstering an environment that incentivizes organizations to strengthen their IT systems. I hope my colleagues recognize the importance of investing into defensive cybersecurity capacity and join me in supporting funding of the Technology Modernization Fund in the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill and supporting the Secure Elections Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor